I am the second of 4 children, and my siblings and I all went to this little private school that was around the corner from our house growing up. It was called Brook Hollow Christian School. And kindergarten through about 8th grade or so, we went to this little school. It was a very conservative Christian school where they didn't allow you to wear pants to this school. You had to wear a skirt. And it was back in the day where the skirt better not be below the hemline of your fingertips. They would measure it to make sure that it was the exact length that it needed to be. It was serious business, which also meant that our teachers didn't wear pants. They wore skirts as well. And I remember every single one of my teachers from every year. I was endeared to them and them to me. The classes were quite small, so we got to know each other very well. Miss Wright was my 2nd grade teacher. I loved Miss Wright, and I can still see her clearly in my mind's eye. To me, as an 8-year-old in the 2nd grade, she seemed to only have 3 skirts that she owned. They were in constant rotation. It was a black one, a navy one, and a cream-colored one. She seemed to have several different blouses she would pair with these 3 skirts, and they were about ankle length, all of them, or mid-calf length, and they were kind of folded and had ruffles and folds in them. When she walked past the desk, I can hear it, swish, swish, swish. She had dark black hair. The only daring that she ever took with her makeup, I recall, was that she had eyeliner that was dark black and it was kind of wedged up on the side so that she had that enchanting cat eye look. I was so drawn to the beauty of Miss Wright. And man, yeah, that hair, that was back in the day where women used to roller set their hair, where with that wet hair, you put it on those hard rollers and then you sat underneath the dryer for an hour or more. And she would come into class, and for the entire week, she had that helmet of hair on her head, and she cemented it, and I mean cemented it, with hairspray. It was so thickly put on her hair that I remember as she'd walk throughout the classroom, the lights would catch the film of hairspray that was on the top of her hair. That was Miss Wright of the 2nd grade. And I remember that to me and my friends, this was the only dimension of her that actually existed. Maybe you remember feeling that way about your teachers. It never occurred to you they have a life. Like, it never occurred to you that they did other things other than stand in this classroom in that skirt in front of that blackboard with that chalk in their hands, with the helmet on their head, and teach this particular class. Which is why one particular day I was completely shocked when on this hot Texas Saturday, I went grocery shopping with my mom, and I was standing there queuing up in the checkout line, scanning all the forbidden candies that were there on the racks, trying to figure out which one I was gonna beg my mom to get me on this particular occasion. When I looked over the top rack and saw Miss Wright standing in the next line, I was completely frozen in shock, because this is the first time it occurred to me that she did other things other than teach the 2nd grade. There she was standing there, and her hair was not in the same style it was always in. It was kind of hanging loosely and romantically around her shoulders. And I remember she just had on a very light little plastering of blush on her cheeks. The eyeliner was not there. I had never seen her like this. And she had on shorts. What I'm saying to you is I didn't know Miss Wright had legs. I was completely dumbfounded as I stared at her. She was standing next to a man I assumed to be her husband, standing next to a young boy that I assumed to be her son. She had a family, and she had knees, and apparently she went grocery shopping on Saturdays. It had never occurred to me that she had more to her beyond the one dimension in which I was used to seeing her. I had relegated her to this little box, and it occurred to me through the years, and by the way, in the 40 years that have passed since then, I don't remember if I even said anything to her, because I was dumbfounded at the fact that I was seeing her and her knees. And if somebody had asked me or any of my fellow classmates at the time, who do you say Miss Wright is? We would have said she's a good teacher. We would have said that's all she is. She's a good teacher. We would have put her in that one box, and by putting her in that box, it didn't limit her life. She still went to brunch on Sundays and went to church and took walks with friends and went grocery shopping. She had a life. It didn't limit her. The box just limited my relationship with her. It limited my experience of her, my expectation of her, my encounters of her were limited because I didn't know and understand and have an awareness of the full scope of who this woman was. Which is why one of the most poignant and powerful and necessary questions that Jesus asks in the New Testament is the same question that he's getting ready to ask you today. Because in Luke chapter 9, in verse 18 and 19 and 20, he looks at his disciples and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" It's a necessary question for you to consider, because most often we have this tendency where we've put God in a box that matches up with our experience, or it matches up with the denomination we grew up in, or it matches up with the traditions of our family line, where we've come from, what our mama and grandmama and them said that Jesus was. Maybe what the culture around you is declaring that Jesus is, but Jesus asked the 12 disciples in the New Testament, y'all, and he asks us today so that we can consider for ourselves, who do you say that Jesus is? The reason why this question is going to be so important in Luke chapter 9 for these 12 disciples that are following closely with Jesus, the reason why it's going to matter so much is because in verse 23 of Luke chapter 9, he is about to give them one of the most stunning and staggering invitations that they will ever receive, that we will ever receive. He's going to invite them to be disciples. They're already believers, but he's getting ready to invite them to surrender all. And here's what he's gonna say to them in Luke chapter 9, verse 23. If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to gain his life is actually gonna have to lose it. And whoever is going to find his life is going to lose it for my sake. For what does it profit a man who gains the whole wide world but loses his soul? He's gonna offer an invitation to discipleship to these 12. But before the invitation, he asks them a question about his identity. Identity first, invitation later. Because think about the gravity and the weightiness of the descriptive words that Jesus uses to describe discipleship here. He says things like deny, cross, lose, follow me. Y'all, think of how sobering these terms actually are, that remind us that actually surrendering all, actually being the kind of disciple that Jesus describes here, it really does require and necessitate a solid divorce from much of what society and even the Christian culture has begun to purport and promote that following Jesus actually looks like. It flies in the face of a self-focused faith that celebrates excess and hustle and a life of ease and comfort as being the mark of what divine favor is on somebody's life. It's going to demand that reorient the compass of all our religious activity back in the direction of virtues that have been lost, like simplicity and discipline and obedience and holiness and the restraint that the Spirit of God develops within us. It reminds us that we're going to have to recalibrate and reckon with what it actually means to surrender all, to follow Jesus fully and completely. Because y'all, there are many people who have placed faith in him, but there are much fewer who have actually decided to follow him, to walk in step with him. And the question we've got to ask ourselves honestly and truthfully is, will we pursue and surrender to this discipleship, Christ's definition of discipleship? Or are we actually going to create our own definition that coddles our flesh and esteems this earth more highly than the kingdom of heaven? But no, on this occasion right here, when Jesus describes what it means to surrender all, he cuts the legs out from underneath the modernized, politicized, cliche version of discipleship that we've seen bubbling up to the surface, and he defines what it actually means to follow him, to live in step with him, to walk with him, to surrender to him. He makes it plain and clear on this day that it looks more like selflessness than it does selfishness. That it actually requires that we trust him with our lives, with our futures. It means that we're more interested in being marked by the Holy Spirit than marketing ourselves. That we trust him and surrender all to him. And for that kind of invitation, like to really be willing to surrender all, we're gonna have to know who Jesus is. Because why would we surrender our lives to somebody who's just a good teacher? Why would we surrender to somebody unless we actually believe that he is who he said he is? That he actually did redeem us, that he actually did pay a debt that we could not pay on our own, that apart from the gracious gift of salvation, we would be separated from God for eternity and find ourselves in the pit of hell. If we really don't believe it, then we won't actually follow him and surrender all. So he deals with his identity first before the invitation. Our willingness to surrender fully and completely to him demands that we ask ourselves the question, who do we say Jesus is?